Now, uh, I, it's hard to imagine. Again, it's theoretical because it's so hard to imagine that this would happen in real life, that students would go and get together and actually chant calls for actual genocide. Um, eh, but if they did, again, and this is where it gets tough because it is so abhorrent and it's so sickening and it's so unbelievable to believe that it would ever happen because it's so abhorrent and so gross. But you have to get to the root of it. If the what So let's just go down this road theoretically and philosophically. Let's tap into my philosophy degree that I got in college. Okay. So, why is calling for genocide? If you're going to say it's bullying and harassment, let's go down this road. If you're going to say that, why is it? Well, the answer people give is because that is, obviously you're calling for the actual physical harm and death of people. So if you're going to call for something that causes the physical harm and death of individuals, then that should be that is not free speech. And some people believe that. They say that it isn't free speech to call for that. That's not true. It is not free. It's not free speech if you're calling for actual threats or incitement to imminent acts of lawlessness. That is when it becomes criminal, when you're actually saying, let's kill this person, or let's get to, you're actually plotting, planning, and calling for the actual action of something, not just a philosophical thought about something. And it's hard sometimes to distinguish between these, and the line gets a little bit thin at times. But if the reason why we cannot legally, or we're going to make this against the code of conduct, you're going to get expelled, you're going to get fired, to call for genocide is because it causes physical harm and death, then you have to remain consistent in that line of thinking. And you'd have to say, no one could ever call for revolution or war because revolution calls for the death. Potentially, it would result in death and violence. And war certainly results in death and violence. So if you were to then have a bunch of people saying, we should absolutely go to war with China. Let's say China invades Taiwan, and you got a bunch of students who are saying, yeah, they're pro-Taiwan, and they believe that we should go to war in order to fight on behalf of Taiwan. That is a statement that leads to the violence. It leads to harm and death of an individual. So you wouldn't be able to if you're going to make that type of speech illegal, you have to keep it consistent. It can't just be, well, it's only illegal in instances that I find it abhorrent to call for that war. And that's what these students were calling for. So some of them will say, well, no, intifada is not war. It's uprising, it's resistance. It doesn't mean necessarily violence. And that may be true, but for some, it may actually mean a violent revolution. Again, you can't criminalize that or penalize that necessarily, because then you'd have to criminalize and penalize all calls for all war. And at times, there may be times where you feel like it's absolutely necessary. Some people feel, for example, right now that Israel going after Hamas is necessary. That results in the death and violence of people. So if you're going to say calling for something that results in death and violence should be illegal or against codes of conduct, you have to remain consistent with that. And that is why we don't put these types of restrictions on speech, because you'd have to apply it to everything. And then there are certain circumstances where you're like, well, wait a minute, but it's okay to call for war. For example, if we if we were able to time travel back in time to World War II times, would it be okay to call for war against the Germans in order to save the Jews? You would say, yes, of course it's okay to call for that. Well, then that is why you can't make it illegal or against a code of conduct to call for even war, which does absolutely lead to violence, death, and destruction of people. You wouldn't be able to call for war. You would say, well, but only the wars I like. That's not the way it works. That's not how free speech works. So we have to remain consistent. And that is why it's difficult to say. But even if a group of people were calling for genocide, is sickening and horrible as it is, just like the neo-Nazi parades in northern Idaho were, people just didn't show up. I mean, look, they were just unpopular ideas. No one showed up. They were allowed to do it. We turned and we're like, oh, great. I guess they're going to have their parade. It's disgusting. Everybody was sickened by it. Everybody was disgusted by it. it was allowed to happen and nobody showed up because it was an unpopular idea. And the world is filled with better ideas. And so that is how you fight that's how you fight these ideas. Even I was watching Fox News today, and they were talking about how when they went to these students at these universities and they explained to them what free Palestine from the river to the sea, what that meant, basically what they explained to them was, you realize this means genocide, which again that's up for interpretation. But that's what they told these students. That's what it meant. And they said, so do you still support that phrase? And they said 67% of the students changed their mind that they told that to. So that is why we advocate for free speech, because even if you think that that slogan does mean genocide, banning it doesn't help. But going and explaining to somebody changes 67% of the minds just right there in a little poll that Fox News was conducting. Imagine if you spent a little bit more time with people. You'd maybe be able to get more and more people to your viewpoint, your way of thinking. But that's what dialogue is for. That's what free speech is about. It's about talking things through and then and getting to the root of these ideas. Why do you have these ideas? Why do you have these abhorrent ideas? Talking is how we convert people to our way of thinking. And if we can't, then maybe we're the ones who need to convert our way of thinking, because maybe we're the ones who have these really abhorrent thoughts and we don't realize that. No one thinks I have abhorrent thoughts, I'm a bad person. Nobody ever thinks that. They have to be educated and brought and they have to become enlightened enough to realize, wait a minute, I've had some really bad ideas. And I think all of us in our lifetimes can look back and say, I've had some really bad ideas. And I'm glad I grew up. I'm glad I learned more. I'm glad I became educated. And I'm glad I changed my mind. And that is what free speech is about. So good for these presidents for finally standing up for free speech for once. I would love to see them be actually consistent in that and to be about free speech for everything. I'm not going to hold my breath on that.